Israel's army chief has met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu amid growing tensions over plans to occupy the Gaza Strip. Israeli media are reporting that the army's top brass have presented the Prime Minister with several alternative plans. According to early reports, Netanyahu is considering occupying all of Gaza. Army leaders say that could endanger the lives of the remaining hostages. The Prime Minister has not commented on the reports. Speaking to army recruits on Tuesday, Netanyahu reiterated what their objectives are.
It is still necessary to complete the defeat of the enemy in Gaza, to release all of our hostages, to ensure that Gaza will no longer pose a threat to Israel. We are not giving up on any of these tasks. We will do it together through the great sacrifice of our male and female fighters.
The reports that Israel could completely occupy the Gaza Strip have sparked concern at the United Nations. At a meeting of the Security Council in New York, UN's Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Jenca spoke of distressing accounts from released hostages who cited deprivation, ill treatment, and abuse by Palestinian militants. But he warned that military escalation by Israel could further harm the remaining captives.
Latest reports regarding Prime Minister Netanyahu's possible decision to expand Israel's military operations through the entire Gaza Strip, if true, are deeply alarming. This would risk catastrophic consequences for millions of Palestinians and could further endanger the lives of the remaining hostages in Gaza. International law is clear in this regard. Gaza is and must remain an integral part of a future Palestinian state.
Let's cross over to our correspondent, Tania Krämer in Jerusalem. Tania, we just saw the UN Security Council there warning against an expansion of the war in Gaza. How determined is Prime Minister Netanyahu to push ahead with this?
Well, we understand that the Security Cabinet will possibly vote or come together and vote on a full occupation of Gaza on this plan on Thursday. It had been postponed from Tuesday, as reports here say. Now, what does it actually mean? I mean, the Israeli military has said they already have the operational control over 75% of the Gaza Strip. They have control over the sea, over the land, over the air. So that would mean they would occupy the remaining 25% of the Gaza Strip. Now the question is, where will all the displaced Palestinian residents then go? Because we know this is mainly the area where most of the Palestinians that have been displaced from those areas that are already under control from the Israeli army, from the north, from the other areas pushed towards the west, Gaza City, for example, or Al-Mawasi in the western area. Now, there's also the question here that is being discussed, what will come then after that full occupation? Is it then a military rule? Does that mean, what are the, will Israel then really take responsibility as occupying power? And also will that mean resettlement by Israeli settlers of Gaza? And that has created those tensions you were talking about between the military leadership and the government.
Talk to us more about that tension, Tania, because the Israeli military is also opposed to a full occupation of Gaza. It's said to have presented Netanyahu with alternative plans. Do we know anything about those alternative plans?
Well, we only know from reports, that are coming out from these meetings and what we're hearing from several officials. Now, this had made the headlines again this morning, this apparent rift between Netanyahu and his chief of staff. Now, we understand, according to some reports, but they're all unconfirmed, is that the army presented a plan to lay siege on Gaza City, mainly on the areas of Deir Balach and also Al-Mawasi. They're talking about, more airstrikes and raid into those areas to pressure Hamas. The army leadership has said they're concerned about the lives of the hostages that will be in danger, and we saw those pictures coming out of Gaza, but also they're saying more soldiers will be killed and injured, and also it will possibly overstretch the reserve of the army to have this prolonged war continuing. But of course, all this talk, about but these scenarios are rather meaningless for the civilian population in Gaza, because both scenarios would mean for them basically more displacement, more killing, when the humanitarian situation is already so dire for them, and more will be killed by either by airstrikes or ground offenses or by starvation.
Tania, thank you very much as always. Our correspondent Tania Krämer in Jerusalem.
Let's bring in Dr. Sina Azodi. He's an assistant professor of Middle East politics at George Washington University in the U.S. Welcome to the day. It's great to have you on the show. Now, how realistic is Netanyahu's stated goal of defeating Hamas militarily, and what would defeat actually look like?
Well, good to be with you. Thank you for having me. Look, in terms of dismantling Hamas's ability to fight, I think Israel has already achieved its objective. But destroying Hamas in terms of its ideology, I don't think any military force in the world can do it. The reason is, and when you look at the officials, the Israeli officials, when they say that the only solution is a path to a Palestinian state, as long as there is no Palestinian state, the ideology of Hamas, the nationalism, the aspirations for a Palestinian state will continue. And only the cycle of violence will be there, because you have a lot of people who are angry, they want to have their own state, they resort to violence, terrorism, and then there's a backlash from the Israelis, and there's, we're going to be stuck in this cycle of violence, and we're not going to go anywhere as long as we can eliminate the ideology of Hamas, and offering Palestinians a better a future, an alternative future other than Hamas.
Israel's military and security elite is fiercely opposed to an expansion of the war. Why do you think Netanyahu seems to be ignoring their concerns?
Well, I think the Prime Minister is concerned with his own political future, because as soon as this war is ended, he is going to have to answer to investigations of what happened on October 7th, why the Israelis were caught off guard, and then the Prime Minister has his own judicial cases in the Israeli judicial system. So while he is the Prime Minister, he can always invoke national security, the continuation of war, to postpone those. But as I said, once the war is over, he's going to lose that immunity, and I think his future will not be very great.
There are speculations that this could all just be a pressure tactic for negotiations with Hamas. What do you make of that?
I don't think so. I mean, look, the war has continued for the past, since 2023. The last hostages that were released were in February of 2025. The Palestinians in Gaza are facing starvation. The hostages are also facing starvation and lack of food. And the Prime Minister has failed to bring back the hostages. The Israeli society is very much opposed to this. So I don't think this pressure tactic, as he calls it, has succeeded in bringing in any meaningful results.
Let's suppose he is serious, then. What would a full occupation of the Gaza Strip look like, and what would it mean for the Palestinians living there?
Well, it would mean that the Israelis will be completely responsible as an occupying force for the safety and security of the Palestinians who live there. But also there will be some, at least, on the surface, there will be some backlash from the countries, including France, Great Britain, who have said that they will recognize the Palestinian state. The British Prime Minister just last week said that unless there's a Palestinian state, he will recognize unilaterally an independent state of Palestine. I don't think the Prime Minister of Israel is going that. He's going to be in a difficult situation in providing food, safety, security for the Palestinians there. At the same time, he doesn't want to have a Palestinian state. But if he decides to go ahead with this plan, and going back to your question, I think the situation will be more difficult for the Israeli forces because you're going to have a new wave of violence there because no nation wants to be ruled by an occupying force. So we're going to witness more violence, which will result in more violence. And as I said a few minutes ago, we're going to be back in this cycle of terrorism, killing, more starvation for Palestinians. And I don't think it will be pretty for the Israeli forces either.
How would you expect regional actors like Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia to respond to a full-scale seizure of Gaza?
Well, I don't think that they can do anything meaningful, but I think in the long term, occupation of Gaza or the annexation of either the West Bank could erode the peace treaties that Israel has with the Palestinians, with Jordanians. It will kill the prospects of any normalization with the Saudis. Emiratis will be in a very difficult situation because they made peace with the Israelis. Because the Arab society, the Arab population is really not in support of making a peace with the Israelis as long as there is no Palestinian state. So I think an annexation or full occupation of Gaza, or the case of West Bank, in either case, I don't think in the long term will serve the interests of any actor in the region, including the Israelis.
And also, I mean, we need to bear in mind that Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories is, according to the ICJ, against international law. What do you predict would be the legal and diplomatic consequences for Israel if it pursues indefinite occupation?
Well, I don't think in the court of public opinion will look good on the Israelis because Israel portrays itself as the only liberal democracy in the region. And liberal democracies, at least, are supposed to be law-abiding actors on the international stage. But if the Israelis decide to violate international law so explicitly, it will not look good on them. But in terms of ramifications, honestly, I don't think there will be much ramifications because the U.S. unconditionally supports Israel. It has gone to great lengths sanctioning ICC contradicting ICJ rulings to protect the interests of itself and Israel. So I don't think, and in doing so, it has actually diminished the authority and credibility of the institution that itself helped to create. So in terms of legal ramifications, I don't think there will be much, but in the court of public opinion, I don't think it will look good on the Israeli government.
That was Dr. Sina Azodi of George Washington University. Thanks so much for your analysis.
Thank you for having me.
For more on this, I'm now joined by Giorgio Cafiero. He is a Middle East analyst and CEO and founder of Gulf State Analytics. Giorgio, welcome to the program. Benjamin Netanyahu reportedly wants to expand the military offensive in Gaza and potentially order the complete takeover of the territory. How would that help get the hostages out?
Yeah, thanks for having me on your program. You know, about 22 months into this conflict, I think obviously there's a tremendous amount of anger on the part of Netanyahu and those in his government who realize that Israel has failed to achieve all of its wartime goals. And I think in light of the talks that were taking place in Doha last month, basically breaking down in acrimony, what is clear is that Netanyahu is trying to set forth a different approach to the situation in Gaza and this idea of doing a full conquest, a full annexation of the Gaza Strip is one that other people, officials in Israel, have been suggesting and proposing at previous points in the war. But I think at this point, Netanyahu is of the view that this is what his country has to do to win in Gaza. Of course, win as Netanyahu defines it. And I think that the view from Netanyahu and the ultra-right-wing members of his cabinet is that this is the move that has to be done to free the hostages and to defeat Hamas. Of course, those I'm sure we'll talk about, though, this really subjects the hostages to an incredibly dangerous, this would subject the hostages to an incredibly dangerous scenario. I think that if the Israeli forces were to come into the areas wherever these roughly 20 living Israelis held captive are present, there is a high probability that Hamas would execute them. Also, there's a question about what happens after Israel does annex all of Gaza. This is one of the most densely crowded pieces of real estate in the world, and there would be a tremendous amount of armed resistance. I think this would basically guarantee long-term warfare in Gaza if the Netanyahu government decides to move forward with this annexation plan.
Could this be Israel's or Mr. Netanyahu's way of pressuring Hamas to put their weapons down?
Well, yeah, originally, as we saw in the reports from late last month, Netanyahu was proposing this as sort of a way of pressuring Hamas, saying that if they're not going to free the Israelis who've been held captive since October 2023, and if they're not going to disarm, essentially, if Hamas is not going to completely capitulate to Israel, that the Israeli military would begin annexing parts of Gaza. So, yes, this is certainly supposed to be understood as some sort of a pressure tactic on Hamas.
Speaking of that annexation that you've referred to multiple times, if Israel were to take full control over the Gaza Strip, what will happen to the Palestinians living there?
Well, as I was saying, I think Israel making that kind of move would basically guarantee long-term armed resistance. I think that it's very naive to think that Israel can just simply annex all of Gaza and then it is going to become some sort of a Monaco on the Eastern Med. I mean, this is going to be a territory filled with Palestinians who will be resisting in every single way possible. And I certainly we don't know exactly how things would play out, but I think it's safe to say it would be a very, very violent chapter in Gaza's history if the Israelis go ahead with this plan.
Mm-hmm. Now, many of Israel's international allies have long condemned the occupation of Palestinian territories and they support a two-state solution. How much weight do their words have in the eyes of the current government?
I don't think that Netanyahu and those around him care at all what countries in Europe think about where the borders between Israel and Palestine exist or should exist. I think that from the perspective of Netanyahu and those in his cabinet, it's basically irrelevant how a number of countries in Europe are making plans to recognize the state of Palestine, despite being very cautious about doing so in the past. I think as long as the United States, with Trump in the White House, is going to be providing Israel with ironclad and unconditional support, Israel will go ahead and do whatever it wants to do, including annexing Gaza. I think that it's important for countries in Europe to make it clear where they stand and to signal that they don't agree with Washington when it comes to the issue of a Palestinian state. But on the ground in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, it's going to have no sort of concrete impact in the short term. It's very much, diplomatically, it's a significant move. It's very symbolic. It carries much weight in terms of international relations and the signaling that takes place in international relations. But on the ground, it's not going to have an impact. I think, if anything, probably Netanyahu and those around him sort of enjoy antagonizing European countries that have been to some limited extent, issuing some mild criticism of Israel. I mean, I'll just repeat. I think Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, and others in the cabinet they could care less what these European countries think about sort of this aspiration for a Palestinian state.
Strong words. That's Giorgio Cafiero from the Middle East expert. Thank you so much.
Thank you.